عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. الحمد لله على نعمة الإسلام وكفى بها نعمة. الحمد لله that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provided us with the Quran and with the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and provided this Ummah throughout history with men and women who studied this deen and studied the reality and gave us insight into many of these things. They devoted their lives for causes that are causes for the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We have discussed a few weeks back with Brother Hassan the life and legacy of Sheikh Yusuf al-Qardawi and Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi. May Allah have mercy on them and accept them. Today, it's a different flavor. It's a person who was born in 1905 in Algeria and studied as a child in a Quranic school, and then he was sent to a French school in Algeria. From there, he finished school and eventually went to France looking for a job. And he did not get a good job, so he went back to Algeria, stayed for a while, worked, and then he decided to go back to France and seek to go and get education. Eventually, he got a degree in electrical engineering. But throughout his life and way until 1956, when he left France to Egypt, he had worked, studied the Western civilization, and start looking into the civilization from the perspective of the Islamic civilization. And he have done an outstanding job at many aspects. He have written many books. Let me try first to explain something that he was suffering, from. His first language was French. In fact, all his books, except I think one or two, were in French, because his Arabiya was very, very, very weak. Remember, France colonized Algeria starting in the year, what year? 1830. 1830. And France basically tried to wipe out Islam and the Arabic language from Algeria. Wipe it out. In fact, until today, you will find this effect on the Arabic language still in Algeria. And the president of Algeria a few weeks ago was saying that France, from 1830 to 1962, when they withdrew, they killed half of the Algerian population. And Algeria is known as the country of, or the land of 1 million shaheed, those who were fighting. We are not talking about the many civilians that the French wiped out from the face of the earth. So in that environment, Malik ibn Nabi was raised. And he was always close to the average person when he was in Algeria, when he was in France. And you can see that he really did not get training in the traditional Islamic studies in this regard. But there was a major meeting between him and one of the outstanding scholars of Algeria. If you ask any Algerian about who is the most prominent name in modern Algeria, they will tell you it is Sheikh Abdul Hamid ibn Badis. Abdul Hamid ibn Badis. Abdul Hamid ibn Badis had the Shari training. Abdul Hamid ibn Badis was a scholar. In fact, he established many organizations, among them the scholars, Muslim scholars in Algeria. So in 1928, there was this interaction between Malik ibn Nabi and Ibn Badis. And from that point on, people will tell you that he was influenced to a great extent by Ibn Badis. Now, Ibn Badis, may Allah have mercy on him, was born in 1889. And he only lived about 50 years. He died in 1940. But during this period of time, Ibn Badis have fought very hard to instill Islam and Arabiya within the Algerian society. And he have interacted with Al-Ibrahimi and others at the time. As far as Malik ibn Nabi, beside Ibn Badis, one of his most, or also people who influenced him is Al-Tahir ibn Ashur, who is a Tunisian scholar. He has Al-Tahwir al-Tanwir. It's a big book of tafsir, maybe around 20 plus volumes, who also died in the 70s. But the main contribution of Malik ibn Nabi is studying the colonialist, studying Western civilization, and at the same time studying the Islamic civilization and addressing the question of the Ummah, the situation of the Ummah, where the Ummah is heading, where it should be going. One of the things that of interest from early on, he realized that the bulk of the people are just like him. Their Arabiya is very weak. He said that people cannot, by reading the Quran, cannot say this is the words of Allah. Because their eloquency in Arabiya is next to null. And with many of the Muslim countries at the time being under the rule of the colonial systems, who fought Islam and Arabiya, not as bad as Algeria, but it was fought, and English was introduced, and French was introduced. That's why, for example, in Lebanon and Syria, you will find people speaking French. Iran, Pakistan, India, the elites, they speak English better than their own language. So this was the effect of the colonialist in the Muslim land. Not to talk about similarly Iran and Iraq, where the British were there, or talk about the French in Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, and sub-Sahara Africa, until today. Until today, the countries are there. So Malik ibn Nabi came with a book called Al-Zahira Al-Qur'aniyya, the Quranic phenomenon. He said, I cannot just talk to a young man and tell him, just read the Quran and you will realize it is American. Because he does not have what it takes. He said, the Arabs, that was their language. And when the Prophet ﷺ came up with this Quran as a wahi from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for them, they recognize that this is not their typical, kalam. This is not their typical way of expressing themselves. And it was mentioned more than one story in this regard. So he wrote this book called The Quranic Phenomenon. It's in Arabic and English. Originally he wrote it in French, to look at this matter and how a young person studying, a young Muslim, want to understand the Quran, that how he can see it through other means, including comparison. For example, he did the comparison between the story in the Quran and the story in the Bible. But his main effect was in some of the concepts that he introduced, like al-qabiliyya lil-istimar. He said nations only get colonized if they have this intrinsic, within them, that we are looking for to be colonized. And they were ready to be colonized. And they are looking in a way to the colonial system that it is a ripe land to be taken over. And he goes into details about how the Western culture came to the Muslims and how the Muslims who try to liberate themselves from Western culture missed the point. They thought that by bringing Western cars, by bringing Western furniture, by bringing Western this and Western this, they're going to go and become, countries that will have a place in the world, and they will have a civilization that they can be proud of. He said, absolutely not. You are just as if you have a house that is shaken, that is, gonna fall, and you come and go and bring from the West the best furniture and the best ornament and the best this and the best that, thinking that this would make this house survive and prosper. And he said, when the reality, it will fall on your head, because you are not really bringing or dealing with the root cause. What is the root cause? The root cause is that the Ummah lost its direction. And the Ummah have accepted the Western values. Now, what he's talking about, this قابلية للاستعمار, that they are, in a sense, ready to be colonized or give the signals. I think in one of the cases in Africa, a clear example, when the president he said the white man, meaning the Europeans, came to Africa and they told us how to pray when our eyes are closed. This is the president. He said, when we open our eyes, before we had the land, they have the book, the Bible. After we open our eyes, we had the book and they had the land. Let me repeat that. So this president of one of those African countries, he said the white man meaning European colonialists, came to Africa. They taught us how to pray when our eyes are closed. They had the book, the Bible. We had the land. In Africa, we own the land. When we open our eyes, after they teach them Christianity, he said, we discovered that we got the book, the Bible, so we became a Christian. But who got the land? It was the colonialist. So basically, it's a similar thing that took place in the Muslim land. And Malik ibn Nabi says what constitutes civilization is this human, is this land, and the time factor. He said, look to Arabia before Islam. What came out of the human? Not much. They were fighting each other for the silliest things. No ideas, no thoughts, no civilization, no products, no anything that can be mentioned. What about the time? There was not any value for the time. Just people killing time left, and whenever they are excited to go and fight to protect either their resources or to get other resources or kill each other. So basically, that was the society at the time. And the land was there, not much that was utilized in this regard. Then he comes and says, look, after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed Iqra. Iqra. He said it came with an idea. That was the link with the Sama, the Wahi. From that point on, this illiterate group of people have built a civilization that was able to absorb other civilization and advance at every aspect of life. Let me just mention this part and then we'll take it to Brother Hassan, inshallah. He take a lesson, a big one, from the Japanese. He said, what's the difference between the Muslims and the Japanese? He said the Japanese came to the Western civilization. As you are aware, Japan lost World War II, and the US have dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. They did not drop it on Germany, although Germany was a much more dangerous thing, right? Where they drop it? On Japan. And they forced the Japanese to adhere to a constitution that the Americans have written, and they put restriction on their armament and so on and so forth. But the Japanese, within a short period of time, they were able to study the Western civilization, take from it what they think was appropriate for their own culture, for their own way of life, for their own civilization, and to advance on that basis. What happened to the Muslims? The Muslims have put their Islam on the shelf, and they have taken basically whatever came from the West. Iran is an example, Iraq, another example, Syria, a third example, Lebanon, a fourth example. Turkey early on was a very clear example where basically even the adhan was changed. To teach your children Arabiya or Quran, you could go to jail. That's in Turkey, where the bulk of the people are Muslims. That was the center of the Islamic state. And the women were forced to change and dress in the Western dress. So Malik ibn Nabi is saying basically what the Muslims have taken from the Western civilization is the filth that came from it. Not much. And they thought that by getting other goodies, they will advance. But he said the shock came in 1967 when they lost Palestine, Golan Heights in Syria, Sinai Peninsula to the Zionists. Although they had the money, they have the oil, and they have armament, and they have men that is way, 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 way more than what the Zionists had. He said then the Ummah realized that they are missing something. And we are no longer have an identity. We are just copying what the West have brought to us. And just to illustrate just a small example to make a point here of what he's talking about. In Egypt, toward the end of the Ottomans, it was an honor for any family to get their daughter married to an imam. Somebody graduates from Al-Azhar, every family will wish that he will be, a husband to their daughter. Because that's a prestigious, position in the society. That's somebody that they look up to, somebody who have the knowledge of the deen, somebody. So that was given. When the British came to Egypt, it did not take 2 generations that, you come to a family and says, I have an imam from Al-Azhar. He's asking for your daughter. I said, no, we will not. What had happened? Basically, the British came and they said, anyone who graduates from a secular school will get a salary like this. And if you have many, many opportunities in the society to advance at different levels, to become all the way to a minister. And if you are a graduate of Al-Azhar, your place is a masjid. Not much outside of that. And your salary is way down here. So within 2 generations, this concept flipped and people start following the concept of the Western, of materialism. This is what I am after. No matter what coming from the secular, he could be a person who does not even recognize Allah from that education. But within the society, 2 generations, and this whole concept has a change. Talk about dress in the Muslim land. Talk about the prayers. Many people will not do their prayers. They would not have a slight understanding what Islam is all about, because they are being taught in the schools a system that is secular, and basically even Islam, the way it's taught, it's totally distorted to the point that a generation will not have an understanding. This is the product of the Western education in the Muslim land. So basically, even those who came to study in the West, Malik ibn Nabi says, even those who come to study in the West, regardless if they are serious students or they came for tourism, both of them share in one point, that they did not go deep into what this Western civilization means and where do we as Muslims stand. And of course, his formula is, you are open for any to take from different civilization, given you understand what is your civilization, who are you, what is your mission in this life. And there's a big difference between a source for civilization that's based on the wahi, on the revelation from the Quran and the Sunnah, and there was a whole civilization that was built on this concept before the colonials came and destroyed it and gave their own ideas. So basically, the Arabs, as an example, when he discussed the ideas, ended up taking, for example, this idea of patriotism and nationalism. And basically, they did not realize that this really divided them until today. Until today, this thing of patriotism and nationalism and all those sorts of ism that the kuffar gave the Muslims, we are still abiding by those concepts until his time, and we see the effect of them until today in the bulk of those Muslim countries. Toward the end of his life, Malik ibn Nabi in 1956, let's just go back to 1956, he left France and he resided in Algeria, in Egypt, where he tried to help with the Algerian liberation. Eventually, Algeria gained its independence, although the French influence was still there big time. And Malik ibn Nabi became a consultant for the Ministry of Higher Education, and eventually himself became a Minister of Higher Education in Algeria. After his retirement, he devoted his time to review his books with their translation in Arabiya after he worked on his Arabiya. I close with this event. In 1931, he gave a talk to Algerian immigrants in France, why we are Muslims. And the French intelligence came after him after this lecture. And you can see that such a lecture would be a threat, because basically what they are interested on is for Muslims to meet and discuss the beauty of Western civilization. Although we did not take from this civilization, as he mentioned, except the qushur, what is really, the cover of it that came mixed with the filth of it, not to understand how they study their own history, separate for them, because religion was the obstacle to their, renaissance, and from that point based it on a way that have drafted by the thinkers, and the church was put on the side. While he says our Islam is the source of our pride and our civilization, and what our need is to base our view of life on this Islam, taking into account the modern world and what it has to achieve. For the sake of time, inshallah, let the Brother Hassan, inshallah, take it from here.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So I think Brother Hisham has mostly summarized the topic. I tried to, the first and only book really I read of Malik bin Nabi was the Quranic Phenomenon. And the Quranic Phenomenon is still probably his most well-known book. But I think if you break it down, he has really two fundamental areas where he was provided a deep contribution. One is this idea, as Brother Hisham said, about the Quran, and how do we understand the miracle of the Quran? Because as you access the Quran during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they naturally understood the miracle, because they knew what does poetry look like for them. They knew what did the soothsayers, how did they talk. They knew what was other natural forms of speech around them. And so when they heard the Quran, it was already miraculous to them, because by nature they understood there was a miraculous speech, so much so that they called it kind of magic speech as one of the allegations against it. But by the time now we're coming to 1907, but actually when he was in his 20s, it was 1930, was the 100-year anniversary of France controlling Algeria. And he at that time, of course, the people, first of all, even now you have this whole subsection of Algerians who say we are not Arab. They have their own language as well. But I think part of that mentality is the idea that there's always been this friction from the secular class, from starting by this colonization of the French, to create a new identity which is somehow distinct from Islam, and part of that is to cancel out the Arabic language and to say to people, you're not Arabs. In fact, the Algerian intellectuals, the same contemporaries of Malik bin Nabi, they said, we looked at our history, we didn't find any Algeria. And the only thing we can find is France. So we need to promote French culture. And so you see that's on the one hand, in that society he was growing up in, totally dominated by France. And on the other hand, he had, as Brother Hisham said, bin Badis, Sheikh Maulana Fadilat Sheikh bin Badis, and he started what you could say is kind of a neo-Salafi movement or Salafi movement at that time. Used some of the same language, but part of his purpose, Sheikh Bandis, was that he wanted to revive the study of the Arabic language. He wanted to revive the connection to Arabic in the society and revive Islam, and that was his goal throughout his life. And so you see that was the other side of the pole that Malik bin Nabi was attaching himself to. And he's not someone who wavered in that, because he continuously worked in that way to the detriment of his own family. His father was, his advancement in his career was impeded because of his son's political activities. They gave him worse and worse positions in civil service. He himself, as Brother Hisham said, was arrested for giving this talk, Why Are We Muslims? In fact, the only comfort or protection he got was from joining a Christian youth movement. And they provided him some protection in France, and he was able to give talks about Islam through his membership in that movement. So you see, there was no, he never wavered in this. Quranic Phenomenon he wrote in 1946, and he wrote it while he was in Germany under the bombing. He said that the original copy was destroyed. So he had to write it again from memory later on, years later. And the second thing, so he was trying to convince people about the Quran. How do we come up with the framework for modern people to understand the miracle of the Quran? But the second thing was, how do we understand culture and the nature of culture? Because he was, and frankly, I think one of the reasons why many of you have not read or heard much about Malik bin Nabi is that his work is very dense. You read it, it's full of Western philosophers and intellectuals, from Hegel to Kant to Toynbee to Descartes, and he talks about the ideas of Ibn Khaldun. He was very influenced by Ibn Khaldun. One of the things that obviously many people know, Ibn Khaldun, he talked about how Asabiyya and group mentality, but also he talked about the fact that the occupied people, or the people who are the losers, they take on or try to look up to the victors who have conquered their societies. And that was true during Ibn Khaldun's time, because he was witnessing that himself through some decline of the Muslim civilization. But it was especially noticeable, obviously, to Malik bin Nabi. He was under French occupation of Algeria for 100 years. So it was obvious that the people had adopted this mentality of worshiping the people that had taken over their society. And fundamentally, I just wanted to end with a few things about what he talked about with culture. Unfortunately, I lost access to the original text. I'm still trying to locate the Quranic Phenomenon. I think it's in my father's library somewhere. Well, I'll find it, inshallah, one day. But in last minute, I wasn't able to access the original text. But I did find some commentaries on it, and it reminded me of some of the key points. One of the things that he talked about was Western culture was founded on the idea, or modern Western culture was founded on the idea of rationalism or scientism. In fact, I have one scholar, he talked about Descartes. Descartes had this, and this is a quote from a scholar, the enormous metaphysical assumption that reality to which science has access to is the whole of reality. So that's scientism, right? So whatever you can, you can access through scientific, through human rationality, that becomes all of what you have access to. And in another, a scholar says, humans have no other source of knowledge nor any other means of reasoning, meaning whatever they find in reality, that is all they can use for reasoning. And so he mentioned that this kind of mentality is the reason why you have, for example, communist Russia. He gave the example of the ballet. That, even though in Russia they have communism where they don't believe in capitalism, not today, but at that time, and they believe in this idea of dialectical materialism. And then, on the other hand, you have France, which believes in capitalism. But if the ballet from Russia goes to Paris, it's easily understandable by the people. They have the same culture, and the vice versa as well. But he gave the example of Shakespeare. When they would have Shakespeare in the Arab world, he said that people would laugh at times where the English audience would be confused. Why are the local audience is laughing? Or they would be sad in England, but in the Arab audience would be horrified. For example, he gave an example of one of the plays where at the end, one of the main characters kills another character and then commits suicide. A Shakespearean play, I don't remember the original, but he said that the Arabs, the Muslims in that audience were horrified by the two crimes, murder and suicide. And they overlooked the idea that the poet was trying to bring about the death of beauty, for example. That was the overall arching idea. So I think he gave these examples to try to make us understand that culture itself comes from a set of assumptions about life, about reality, and that when you change some of these assumptions, then the cultures are no longer compatible. And sometimes you have to try to dig to find what are the core assumptions, because after all, communism and capitalism, at least on the superficial level, seem to be totally different, but the core fundamental basis behind them is the same, is that they believe that all of reality is just what you can perceive, and they don't believe in any kind of metaphysical reality. And they believe that human progress is through that intellectual and scientific process and has nothing to do with deen or anything related to what Islam brought in terms of the idea of what is this life and its meaning on a larger level. So I think that's sort of saying in the same way that Brother Hisham said, but maybe in using different words. But essentially, that was his contribution, and I think it's very useful. Anybody can get their hands on Quranic Phenomenon. You have to read that book, like a paragraph at a time. You can't start saying, I'm going to read this book all in one day, because every paragraph is very very dense. You have to really think about it and even research some of the references. So I think, but it does have a lot of value because he attempted to use the intellectual tools of modern philosophers, of modern thinkers, and it really holds up on that level. That there's really no other intellectual peer for Malik bin Nabi in that way. Nobody else really attempted to do the same thing he did, which is use the same high intellectual level of modern thinkers, Western thinkers, to explain Islam, its basis, and also to defend or create a new epistemology, a new way, or define an Islamic epistemology, which is an Islamic way of thinking about the world, and as something separate or different from the Western view of how to think about the world. And so it's very useful to go back and look at his books because they really haven't been duplicated in any substantial way since then. So I think that's what I would encourage everyone.
In the last 10 years, in fact, the name Malik ibn Nabi started coming back, and many young men and women in the Muslim world start hearing and encouraging each other at the intellectual level. Because remember, at the intellectual level, those elites, Geb, who's a Western Orientalist, in 1931 wrote a book, 1931. And in that book, he said that we succeeded in changing the minds and the hearts and the direction of the elites in the Muslim land. But we could not still claim that we penetrated the Muslim population. So he's saying that we got the intellectuals already. They get the intellectuals on their side. They fed them their ideas, spoon feeding, and Malik ibn Nabi was standing on the other side. And he was not, a common phenomenon, because the bulk of the people went with the colonialist. Why? Because that will give you opportunities. If you go with the with the colonialists, that will give you the opportunity. If you are against them, your fate is either jail or to be killed. You have to understand. So when he was, propagating these things, that's a source of, for him, it's a struggle, and a struggle that consequences would be there. I'm going to just mention some of his books. And again, I think what we aim from these sessions is to introduce and make a connection with the 20th century, because we are living among the kuffar. We are living in the lion's den. And we are, as I discussed yesterday in the Khatira, we are losing a big bulk of our own children to this assimilation machinery, because we have little understanding of what this culture is all about. And at the same time, we have little understanding of what Islam is all about. So in 1946, he wrote The Quranic Phenomenon. In 1948, he wrote a book called Shurut al-Nahda, The Condition for Renaissance. And a third, in 1954, The Direction of the Islamic World. He believed in an Islamic Commonwealth, and he tried to propagate that idea. In 1956, the Asian African idea. I mean, all Malik ibn Nabi's life was about idea and civilization. Ideas and civilization. That's what his life goes around. In 1958, he put this Commonwealth, Islamic Commonwealth, in writing in another book. One of his most famous books was in 1959, the same year that I was born in, which is called The Issue or the Problem of Culture, Mushkilat al-Thaqafa. That was at a time when, Ummah was asleep. In 1959, also he wrote another book, which is called The Intellectual Struggle in the Colonialist Countries. In 1960, let's discuss the new structure. حديث في البناء الجديد. In 1961, Some Thoughts, a book called Some Thoughts. In 1962, In the Middle of the Battle. In the 1964, Algerian Horizon. Another book that's not dated, The Biggest Issues, Al-Qadaya Al-Kubra. In 1965, he wrote part of his memoir, The Memory of a Witness on the Century. In 1968, The Product of the Orientalists, Intaj al-Mustashriqin. In 1968, Al-Islam wa Demokratiya, Islam and Democracy. In 1970, another volume of his memoir, A Witness on the Century. In 1970, The Meaning of This Stage. in 1970 also wrote a very, very famous book of his, which is the issue of ideas in the Islamic world. And 1972, the role of Muslim and his message in the last third of the 20th century. And between guidance and misguidance, 1972. A Muslim in the world of economy in 1972. And there are other three books. لبيك حج الفقراء. Respond, لبيك اللهم لبيك. It's as you respond to Allah's call for Hajj. And he called it Hajj al-Fuqara, the Hajj of the poor people. And lastly, he had another one called من أجل التغيير, toward a major change. جزاكم الله خيرا وبارك الله فيكم. We hope that we just get you interested in another thinker of the 20th century who tried his best to awaken this ummah, which is still in its own sleep. Any questions? تفضل يا حسن.
I just wanted to make one other sort of promotion about him, because I think this will be very useful for any young people. So in society, when you talk in a Western society, if you have a public talk or debate between people, people cannot bring religion into the topic, because obviously everybody has their own religion. You can't just argue, why this thing is wrong. Pick any topic, pick homosexuality, or for example, modern age. Why is this, a bad thing? You can't. In our religion, we believe it's wrong. So in fact, there's a kind of secular way of talking about things, about ideas. Even though many people have commented that this way of discussion is kind of disingenuous, because everybody's really coming with their own ideas in the background, which is actually the reason they're debating. This is the real reason why they don't like such and such topic or whatever, but they have to frame it in a way which is suitable for public dialogue. And so that's the one thing that Malik bin Nabi, if you look at his books, he creates the justification for Islamic culture, for civilization, for the Quran, in a way that's suitable for this kind of public dialogue. It uses the same terminologies of a public dialogue in a modern secular state. It uses the same thinkers that you might reference. And so in that way, it really provides you with tools. If you research him and read his work very carefully, you will find great tools that will allow you to engage in that kind of discussion in the modern era. It's very modern in its outlook, really, even though it's written in the 1940s. But
yeah, not much has changed in terms of ideas since that time. Yes, yeah, Brother Sultan. Oh, it was translated to many languages. If English, as many of his books are available in English too. In Arabic, as I said, he only wrote, I think, the book about the colonialist in Arabic. And if you read it, maybe the Arabiya of a brother who converted to Islam in this country and studied Islam for a few years would be much better than that. I mean, the French, again, the French wiped out Arabiya and they tried to wipe out Islam. So it's very rakik. When I read it, I said, wow, this is, Malik, because we have, this picture of Malik bin Nabi. When you study the Arabic, you are surprised to see how weak is that. Yes, go ahead. That's what we have been saying, that not much has changed. That the Muslims who came to this country, they came to this country absorbing the Western civilization, the Western culture, because first of all, they have little understanding and knowledge of Islam. Secondly, they came from a defeated mentality to start with. Thirdly, as Brother Hassan said, it's the character of those who are, being colonized to look up. It's this inferiority complex in this regard. And by the way, you have to understand that this culture It's not just for the immigrant. I think I was discussing the other day that if you look at the African American, we're not talking about Muslims, the African American culture in the 60s, the intellectual level of the African American in the 1960s is way up compared with today. And many people think, oh, the African Americans today is better. Look, I mean, we have all the artists, we have all the players who are making millions and tens of millions and this and this and that. Absolute nonsense. Just go back to the 60s and see it was full of ideas. We need to have, look at the speeches of Malcolm X. Malcolm X, in one of the speeches, was telling the blacks in the front of him, mostly, some of them were Nation of Islam, some of them were just people in this. He was saying, look, why the white man go to the beach? Because he wants to look like you. What is it that he's driving? Because he wants to rebuild this personality. The white man destroyed that personality from the age of the slavery on. This personality was destroyed. So he's just trying to rebuild. And Malcolm X, maybe inshallah we have a session. We bring some brothers who are expert in this regard. He recognized where's the problem. So he tried to rebuild this personality. Same thing with Elijah, with all his aqidah problems, Elijah Muhammad. He came with, I want to build economic institution within the, blacks. And they did. And they did. So at that point, there was an aim, there was an objective. We are something, we need to be something. It's not a question of me, play this or do this or do this. No, I want to be at the table. I have a say of what's going on in this culture. That was the level of discussion at that point. And they were able to water it down to the point now, as I said, they think we have achieved it. We have Kanye West and company. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one other thing, which is you can see an idea of how modern his thinking is. Because one of the things he talked about was how Western occupiers will not allow the existence of a natural culture from the societies that they've occupied. In fact, he talked a lot about African societies, and because he was a part of Africa, and talked about how they will not allow you to even create your own culture or promote your own culture, or have a separate culture from the culture that is based on their own secular underpinnings of their culture is based on certain assumptions and ideas, but they will not even allow you to have your own culture and have it be an acceptable part of the modern or the world stage. And of course, we see that today. You see the World Cup in Qatar, right? So there's all sorts of Western countries, and what are they complaining about? The Islamic culture, and the fact that this is an invalid form of culture according to their own mindset. And so this is exactly what Malik bin Nabi was talking about so many years ago, is that this Western culture will not allow other cultures to exist as a valid other way of existing. In fact, they will seek to dominate and destroy these other cultures, and will never allow them to coexist. And so that's why even you see that example played over and over again. But if you're watching the World Cup, you see how every country is willing to accept atrocities from their own countries, but the cultural assumptions they're not willing to accept any alternative basis for that.
Yeah, inshallah, we need to conclude by 9 o'clock. Any question or comment, inshallah, about what we have discussed today? Yes? I understand. I understand. The brother is saying these ideas, these thoughts need to be expressed in khutbahs in this regard. First of all, it's taped, so it will be on the website, inshallah, for those who want to look at it. The issue, brother, when you discuss these issues in Khutbah Jum'ah, you are talking way above people's heads. They will not know what you are talking about. I mean, that's a major problem that we have. The intellectual level among the Muslims here and abroad. I mean, the fact that you have this widespread opinion that started in the West, conspiracies about COVID-19 and the vaccination. You just go overseas, brother, and listen to what I listened in the summer. That the ground is ripe to receive any nonsense. If you start talking about something of value, people will go to sleep. Because you need a fertile ground. You know, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talk about the land, right? When rain comes, if the land is prepared, it will take the water and grow all sorts of things. But if the land is barren, no matter how much water would come there. So basically, we lack in this aspect, and definitely we need to find ways and means to reach to the public. But always, I think what we need to remember, always the percentage of the people who can absorb and transmit and digest those ideas will be few percentage of the population. So we have, I mean, to live with this reality. The way Allah created, the bulk will follow whatever is there. The time of Malik Nabi, he was not the bulk. He was the opposite. The bulk was with the French. The bulk was with the British. The bulk was with the Germans. The bulk was with the Italians, like in Libya. So those are, and those people, when they left us, they left their own agents to rule the Muslim land. I mean, the king of Bahrain, I close with this. The king of Bahrain gave a talk. This is the king of Bahrain, gave a talk. He said, why in the world, he was talking to the British, why in the world did you leave the Middle East? We want you back. And in fact, I am offering you to establish a base, a military base back in Bahrain. I mean, this is just 2 years ago. Qatar went to who? To Turkey. Libya went to who? To Turkey, a Muslim country. Said, come here. Because Qatar could not trust the United States or England that if Saudi and Emirates attack them, the US and Britain will be watching. So they called upon Turkey, and within 24 hours, Turkish parliament approved sending tanks. And the second day, the Turkish tanks were on the ground in Qatar to protect the country. Bahrain and company, they are asking the British and the Americans to come and have their bases. I mean, what's more than that? That we are asking the colonialists who have, killed our culture to come back and play a major role in it. This just shows how deep is our problem. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring the khair and the good for the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to give hidayah of al-Islam to those who lack it. Allahumma ameen. Jazakum Allahu khair wa barakallahu fikum.